Non-anthropomorphic animals. They run, they fly, they swim, and they have nothing else going on upstairs. Sonic Adventure plants Flicky in its environments as a bright blue bird who can chirp, flutter, and absolutely nothing else. A character whose entire cognitive range stops at what a normal bird is physically capable of. That limitation is not a bug in the design. It is the point. These creatures share names with their anthropomorphic counterparts. There are non-anthropomorphic birds in the same canon that also features an anthropomorphic bird named Storm the Albatross, non-anthropomorphic mammals sharing territory with Miles' Tails Prower and Knuckles the Echidna. The same species names exist in both forms simultaneously, as if Sonic's world simply allows both degrees of personhood to occupy the same zip code. Forum discussions have christened them early animal buddies, a specific category referring to the small, non-anthropomorphic creatures from classic Sonic games, formally recognized as distinct from the main anthropomorphic cast. They are not the same thing as the playable cast, not under a different art style, not temporarily depowered. They are genuinely non-sentient wildlife. The games establish that both humans and non-anthropomorphic animals coexist in the setting, with humans primarily appearing from Sonic Adventure onward. Non-anthropomorphic animals of the same species exist alongside anthropomorphic characters who resemble them, and the canon never pretends these are the same beings under different conditions. The one consistent rule across every appearance is irrelevance. These animals populate stages, appear in cutscenes, fill background slots in overworlds, and never drive a plot, never develop character motivation, never factor into any mission objective. Forum members observe this directly. Non-anthropomorphic animals are simply not significant in the Sonic series compared to anthropomorphic characters. The distinction is not subtle. Flicky's inability to do anything beyond what a normal bird could do mentally or physically is not a narrative constraint the game later subverts. It is a permanent ceiling baked into the character's design and never revisited. Non-anthropomorphic animals are not the series failing to commit to a world-building idea. They are the world-building idea functioning exactly as intended. A persistent, canonically recognized category of creature that shares species names with the cast and shares screen space with them, but never shares a narrative function. The question worth asking is what that reveals about the larger system. Sonic canon is structured around the principle that the same species name can anchor two entirely different kinds of existence, and the distinction between them is not treated as a philosophical problem to explore, but as environmental texture to accept. Human. Where non-anthropomorphic animals narratively fade because biology strips them of agency, humans have no such limitation, and still end up in exactly the same position, present, named, and never the reason anything happens. Dr. Ivo Robotnik, better known as Dr. Eggman, appeared in the 1990 Sonic the Hedgehog game as the franchise's primary human antagonist. Gerald Robotnik, his grandfather, is a named human character introduced in later games who serves as a key figure in the series' backstory. Two humans, a dynastic lineage of intelligence anchoring the series' villainous structure across multiple decades of titles and continuity shifts. That IQ of 300 has not been revised, retconned, or softened. The modern Sonic franchise from the 1991 debut through Sonic Adventure 2 and beyond has maintained the number as fixed canon. 300, not genius level generally, not vaguely brilliant, not off the charts, 300. Exactly specified, repeated, locked in. And this is the figure of a man who, across over 30 years of storytelling, has never once been shown pursuing a problem that his stated intelligence level would actually solve. World hunger, energy abundance, climate engineering, anything. The franchise commits to 300 with the kind of precision most character attributes don't receive across continuity revisions, while the character those attributes belong to spends every entry building increasingly elaborate machines to capture a blue hedgehog who runs fast. The character's extraordinary intelligence is a recurring trait emphasized throughout the franchise. The turn is that this isn't failure, it's the operating logic. The real answer isn't that the writers couldn't make him smarter, it's that Sonic's world has never been obligated to make its internal logic consistent with its character descriptions, and the most specific number in the canon's toolkit, 300, is the clearest proof. The franchise will commit to exact specifications when it matters to the brand identity, and will leave apparent contradictions unresolved when resolving them would change what the series is. The genius doesn't need a reason. He just is. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which species you think has the strangest place in the Sonic canon. Let's get back into it. GUN Soldier. Where the previous entry showed us a human operating far outside his depth as a mad scientist, this next one strips that abstraction down to its most uncomfortable reality. The ordinary people caught in the crossfire of conflicts they never signed up for. In Shadow the Hedgehog, released in 2005, the player is placed in the boots of Shadow, who at multiple points uses a submachine gun to open fire on GUN soldiers, ordinary human military personnel serving the guardian units of nations, the armed wing of Earth's government, the United Federation. These soldiers are not faceless robot goons. They are humans, and the game systems treat them accordingly, cataloging every encounter with the same mechanical indifference applied to every other enemy in the roster. Regardless of which mission path the player selects, hero, dark, or neutral, GUN soldiers will always attack Shadow on sight, and defeating them fills the dark gauge, unlocking his Chaos Blast ability. There is no diplomatic branch, no faction the player can appeal to, no moment where the game acknowledges that these men and women might be following orders rather than choosing a side. They exist in the code as targets. The GUN commander sits at the top of that chain of command, and he holds a personal hatred of Shadow that predates the events of the game by years. That grudge flows downward through the entire organization. Every soldier on the ground is ultimately serving a hierarchy whose leadership would rather see Shadow destroyed than recruited, allied with, or even understood. A specific GUN Soldier 3D model was constructed for the original game and carried forward into Sonic X Shadow Generations, a continuity that stretches back to 2005 and remains current canon. That model exists in the present tense in a game released decades after the character's first appearance, proof that these soldiers are not a forgotten chapter. They are active, ongoing participants in the franchise's military fiction. The quiet horror of the GUN soldier is that they are the only species in the entire franchise whose combat viability is defined entirely by their mortality. Every other species listed here, the echidna, the fox, the bat, the cat, possesses superhuman traits that let them survive scenarios that would kill a human in seconds. A GUN soldier has none of that. A single robot, a single projectile, a single well-placed hit from a hedgehog moving fast enough to break the sound barrier ends them. And the game never pauses to acknowledge that imbalance, never inserts a line of dialogue questioning why humans keep fighting a war against beings who can outrun bullets. The commander's vendetta against Shadow ensures they will keep fighting regardless. The machinery of the United Federation grinds forward, consuming its own personnel as fuel for a grudge held by a man who was never elected, never questioned, never held to account by the people underneath his command. Pig. Where GUN introduce humans as a species defined by their expendability, the pig pulls the camera back to the franchise's very first hours and reveals that even the most basic biological fact about one of those original creatures has been in dispute for over 30 years. In 1991's Sonic the Hedgehog, the game that launched the entire series, an anthropomorphic swine character appeared as an enemy on the Green Hill Zone level. The Japanese version of the Sonic 1 manual gives this character the name Flicky in its story section, accompanied by an identifying image establishing him as a named participant in the world's earliest documented lore. In Western territories, the same manual refers to the pig character as Porker Lewis, an entirely different name for the same creature, with no acknowledgement that a competing identity exists elsewhere. The source of both names traces back to the Sonic Bible, that internal Sega of America document developed during Sonic 1's production specifically for use in Western territories, a document that never reconciled its own regional variants before shipping. The problem hardened across subsequent releases. Rather than converging on a single authoritative name, official materials continued to present two distinct identities as if each were canonical within its own territory. In Japan, the tiny pig animal Flicky received plushie merchandise, an official acknowledgement that locked the Japanese name into physical product and commercial reality. In the West, Porker Lewis simply continued to exist in every manual, every guide, every reference document, with no acknowledgement of the Japanese version. Neither identity was retconned, neither was declared non-canonical, and neither was ever unified with the other. The Sonic Bible had created a fracture at the foundation of the franchise's species roster, and the company let it calcify into permanent ambiguity rather than resolving it. The deeper oddity is that this character, one of only a handful of animal species to appear in the very first Sonic game, should be among the most firmly established creatures in the entire canon. and yet his own name is a geographic coin flip depending on where you bought the manual. The merchandise tied to Picky's Japanese identity proves Sega Japan treated him as a distinct, legitimate character worth manufacturing, while the Western documentation treated Porker Lewis as equally legitimate with no footnote, no asterisk, no acknowledgement that another version existed. The question nobody has answered is whether this was intentional regional differentiation or a continuity breakdown so early in the franchise's history that it never got patched, and as long as two official first-party names exist for one character from one game, the question of which pig represents the real Sonic canon remains permanently unresolved. Rabbit. Whatever was alarming about the pig situation gets worse the moment you look at what Eggman did to rabbits. Pocky is identified as a rabbit character in Sonic canon, which places leopards directly inside the canon from the beginning, and that same canon documents Eggman capturing rabbits specifically to power his badniks. Not as random bystanders caught in crossfire, but as a targeted resource. Sonic and the other heroes freed most of them, which sounds like a clean resolution until you count how many rabbit characters actually exist across the multiple continuities the franchise has run. 12 rabbit characters identified in a Sonic Stadium forum post, spanning every version of the Sonic story from the classic games through to the present. That is a lot of captured and freed rabbits for a species that barely gets narrative space to breathe. Eggman's rabbit abduction reads like a one-off cartoon villain gag until you stack it against the actual release history. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 introduced animal companions that could be freed from badniks, and the rabbit entries in that mechanic weren't arbitrary. They were Pocky and others specifically placed in those machines. The count of freed rabbits grew with every game that used the mechanic, which means by the end of the classic era, the Sonic universe had quietly established that rabbits were a primary target for Dr. Eggman's labor force, alongside the monkeys and birds and chickens that occupied the same mechanical prisons. The mechanic normalized it. Every time a player freed a rabbit from a badnik, they were resolving a scenario the games had set up. Rabbits were captured, and the hero freed them. Nobody at Sega ever needed to explain why rabbits specifically. The gameplay loop made the question unnecessary. And then there is Splats. Splats is a character that appeared in promotional material and toy lines for the Sonic franchise, existed visually and by name in the marketing ecosystem, and then simply never appeared in a game for over 2 decades. 25 years passed between Splats' initial promo and toy appearance and its first official game appearance. That kind of gap is not a scheduling conflict or a production delay. That is a character so low on the priority list that it took the franchise 25 years to find a place to put it, and when it finally did, it was as a background decoration rather than a character with a role. The forum post that identifies 12 rabbit characters across multiple Sonic continuities is counting every rabbit that ever received any form of official recognition, including Splats, including Pocky, including the unnamed rabbit, badnik victims whose only function in the canon was to be captured and freed. The number is high because the franchise kept producing rabbit-shaped content without ever producing rabbit stories. Here is where it gets worse. The Sonic franchise has produced rabbit characters for over 30 years, has used rabbits as a recurring visual and narrative element, has established rabbit-specific canon through Eggman's badnik capture mechanic, and yet not a single rabbit character has ever carried a mainline game story. Pocky exists as a species designation, not a personality. The 12 rabbits across the continuities include background characters, badnik companions, and promotional toys. None of them protagonists, none of them recurring figures with character arcs. You can identify all 12 by name if you have spent enough time in Sonic fan spaces, but you cannot describe any of them with the specificity the Sonic franchise applies to its foxes, its echidnas, its hedgehogs. The rabbit roster is a list, not a cast, and this is the design reason. The Sonic Animal Companion system, the little creatures you freed from badniks in the early games, was built to give players a tactile sense of rescue and to populate the world with cute, recognizable animal types that cost almost nothing to design. Rabbits fit that slot perfectly. Small, cute, already visually distinct from the other animals, and fast enough to feel appropriate next to a character like Sonic. Every rabbit in the early Sonic games exists because the animal companion mechanic needed variety, not because anyone had a rabbit story they wanted to tell. The 12 rabbit characters across the continuities, the Pocky designation, the Eggman capture backstory, the 25-year wait for splats to appear in a game, none of that reflects a rabbit-focused design philosophy. It reflects a slot-filling philosophy that happened to use rabbits. The species was built for the badnik mechanic, and the badnik mechanic was built for Sonic 2, and everything downstream is just the franchise slowly, belatedly trying to produce content that justifies the slot it already filled by accident. Bear. But where the rabbit situation was a case of the franchise accidentally filling a mechanical slot and never properly developing it, the bear situation is something more unusual. The Sonic species roster contains a category that was named, visually referenced, and then almost entirely abandoned. Anthropomorphic ursids appear in the Sonic universe, which means bears exist as a Sonic species the same way rabbits do, but where the rabbit roster accumulated 12 characters across the continuities through sheer mechanical repetition, the bear roster accumulated almost nothing. The forum discussion that identified the 12 rabbits also surfaced a character named Bark, and the description attached to Bark is as brief and definitive as anything in the entire Sonic canon, a bear character currently having no chance of returning, not because the story ruled him out, but because there is no story left for him to be part of. Bark is a polar bear character who appeared in Sonic the Fighters, not even a full visual design that anyone can point to with confidence, and then it gets stranger. The Sonic franchise has, at various points, put virtually every other species it has named into at least one game, with at least one line of dialogue or one cutscene moment. The rabbit characters, even the minor ones, have game appearances. The pig characters, Picky from the Japanese Sonic 1 manual, have at least a textual canon entry with an identifying image. Even species with barely any representation like the seal or the deer have at least one character that crossed from concept or toy into actual game content. Bears do not. Bark appeared in Sonic the Fighters as a playable fighter, a name that someone remembered, attached to a species that the franchise technically recognizes, and then could not find a single canonical appearance to point to. The no chance of returning verdict is not a disappointment about a character who is lost. It is an accurate assessment of a character who was never there to begin with. Here is where it gets strange. Defenders of the Sonic roster will point out that Bark appeared in the classic Sonic game's animal companion system, that bears, like rabbits and birds and seals, were animals you could free from badniks in the early titles, and that this constitutes a real canonical appearance. They are right that bears appear in the companion mechanic, and they are right that this is part of the Sonic canon. But the objection collapses the moment you compare it to how the franchise treated other species in the same mechanic. Birds produced multiple named characters with distinct visual designs and story roles. Seals produced at least one named character with a personality. Even the deer category, which is barely populated, has characters that appear in spin-off material and tie-in media with actual dialogue. Bark the polar bear is a named character who appeared in Sonic the Fighters. Bark is not the bear from the Badnik companion system. Bark is a separate character entirely, and he exists only in a forum post describing a character that does not exist in any official Sonic material. What this proves about the Sonic species roster as a whole is that it was never built as a coherent narrative ecosystem. Every other populated category, rabbits with 12 characters, birds with named cast members, foxes with a franchise lead, can be traced back to a design decision that produced more than one character, more than one appearance, more than one story beat. Bears cannot be traced to anything beyond a species slot that was filled in the companion mechanic and a single name that someone dug up in a forum. The roster contains entries that exist because a game needed animal variety, and it contains entries that exist because a fan remembered a name, and the difference between the two categories is not a storytelling failure or a wasted opportunity. It is the raw infrastructure of a franchise that has spent over 30 years adding species to a list without always adding characters to go with them. Bark has appeared in multiple Sonic games, including Sonic the Fighters and Sonic Heroes. The forum post says it plainly, he is a Sonic series character with no chance of returning, and the proof is not in his absence from the current canon, but in the complete absence of any canon to be absent from. Bird. At least the bear had a reference in an actual game line, however buried it was. The bird has multiple official manuals, internal documents, a starring role in a spin-off, and still isn't canon. The tiny animal that burst from a destroyed badnik in the opening minutes of the original 1991 Sonic the Hedgehog was identified in the Japanese version of that game as Flicky, a bird, one of several animal species scattered across Dr. Eggman's robotic menagerie. That same manual also listed another bird character, giving the same creature type a different designation for the international release. 3 different teams, 3 different names for one species, all within the same launch window. Flicky the bird appeared in the 1996 spin-off Sonic 3D Blast, where rescued birds populated the ending sequence. The tiny animal rescue beat was so effective that it became a recurring franchise motif across the 1990s and into the 2000s, with birds appearing consistently as the payoff for breaking open a badnik. Internal Sega of America continuity documents from the Sonic 1 era treated Flicky as a canonical fixture of the Western Sonic universe, investing official institutional weight in a character the Japanese team had already named differently. And here's the problem: the modern Sonic video game franchise operates on a continuity that deliberately excludes every one of those Western documents. The Sonic Bible, the cartoons, the comics, all of them treated the tiny animals and the freedom fighter characters derived from them as part of one coherent story built across multiple media. The game canon does not. The freedom fighters character is based on bird tiny animals, and every other tiny animal species that received expanded characterization in that Western material were created by Western-developed cartoons, comics, and books, not the game canon. The modern Sonic franchise maintains a separate continuity from that entire body of Western Sonic media, and that separation functions as a hard firewall. The bird is canonically a Flicky in the Japanese game materials, a Chirps in the Western Bible, and a Clucky in a Japanese manual. 3 names, 1 species, and the version of the canon that actually counts now resolve the contradiction by inheriting the Japanese designation and discarding the rest. The bird's multiple identities aren't a charming localization quirk. They're evidence that the character was being developed by different teams who weren't coordinating, and modern canon quietly erased all of them except one, then stopped developing the species entirely. A defender would say the naming differences are just localization choices and don't represent actual contradictions. But the Sonic Bible and the Japanese manual were written for different markets at the same time, named the same character differently, and the modern canon didn't reconcile the two. It picked one, discarded the other, and then gave neither any further development. The bird had more official documentation and narrative prominence in its first 5 years than most Sonic species ever receive, and the current canon uses none of it. Anyone trying to answer the question of what bird species appear in modern Sonic canon walks away with one name, one canonical game appearance, and a long list of alternate versions that don't exist in the story being played. The Sonic bird is the species that almost had a coherent canon and then got discontinued without anyone noticing. Penguin, the previous entry, was a bird buried under conflicting canon. The penguin has canon complications and a plushie to prove someone at Sega once cared about it commercially. The penguin is one of the 7 tiny animals that populate the opening animal forest of the 1991 Sonic the Hedgehog and are trapped inside Dr. Robotnik's badniks until Sonic destroys the robots and frees them. That forest, green, scrolling, populated by rabbits, penguins, deer, and other small creatures, exists for roughly the first 3 minutes of gameplay before the player moves to the first proper zone, and the penguin is one of the sprites the player may or may not notice on the way out. The tiny animal rescue became a recurring franchise motif, reappearing in multiple Sonic titles across the 1990s and into the 2000s, with the penguin appearing sporadically among the rescued creatures. Sega released licensed merchandise featuring the tiny animals from Sonic 1, including the penguin, giving the species a physical object that literally exists in the real world and that someone paid money to manufacture. But here's where it gets quieter. The modern Sonic game canon keeps the tiny animal rescue as a gameplay beat, but has stripped the penguin and every other non-hedgehog, non-fox, non-echidna tiny animal of any individual identity, backstory, or recurring role. The Western continuity that built the freedom fighters and expanded the tiny animals into named characters with story arcs and motivations, gone from the game timeline entirely. The Japanese plushie that proves Sega invested in this character commercially at launch, a physical artifact with no narrative home in the version of the canon that currently matters. The penguin is canonically present in the opening minutes of Sonic 1, no version of the game removes it, and canonically absent from every story the modern franchise tells. It exists as a rescue target and sprite in the opening minutes of Sonic 1 and reappears as a rescuable animal in modern Sonic games without individual identity or narrative role. The penguin is the most visible proof of that editorial principle because it had a commercial investment behind it at launch. A plush line is not something Sega releases for characters they expect to vanish, and the games chose to develop none of it. The Western continuity expanded these animals into an entire resistance movement, and the game canon treated that expansion as if it never happened. The tiny animal it was in 1991 is still the only identity it gets, and the modern franchise has shown zero interest in changing that. Crocodile. So while the penguin species has a single locked role, confined to a badnik inside one zone, the crocodile has no cage at all. Vector the crocodile holds the distinction of being the named representative of his entire species within the franchise, the only member of the crocodile species given an identity in the Sonic canon, and he was grouped alongside Espio the chameleon and Charmy Bee as the Chaotix detective agency, and has appeared across the franchise's character rosters ever since. It isn't a lead, a sidekick, a rival, or a recurring antagonist with a clear role to play. It occupies a slot that would normally require some kind of narrative justification, and nobody ever explained what that justification was supposed to be. The real puzzle researchers bumped up against isn't why Vector stands out among the cast. It's why he stands out at all, given that the slot he occupies never earned itself through any visible metric the franchise uses for character importance. Every roster that counts includes him, and every roster that omits him doesn't actually revoke that standing, it just leaves him off for that particular entry. The people who mapped the franchise's character hierarchy found this one genuinely difficult to pin down. The crocodile never fought its way into the main cast through a story beat, a power demonstration, or a character arc. It simply has the designation permanently, and no one ever needed to produce a reason for keeping it there. People sometimes reach for the Team Chaotix explanation that Vector's membership in that 3-member group accounts for his prominence, but that's mistaking an assigned function for a cause. Being on a team explains why the character exists as a personality. It doesn't explain why the franchise lists him in the same roster category as characters who carry the series' actual narrative weight. The crocodile's main cast status is a structural habit of the franchise, a slot filled before anyone developed a theory about why slots needed reasons to exist. What people usually confuse this with is the logic of team composition, the idea that every main cast member occupies their position because they fill a specific functional gap. The Chaotix Detective Unit gives Vector a clear job as the team's vocal, physical presence, and that feels like it should be the explanation, but team function and main cast roster status are categorically different things. One describes what a character does in a given story, the other describes where the franchise itself places the character in its own internal hierarchy, and Vector holds that placement regardless of whether he's driving, plot, solving mysteries, or sitting on the sidelines of a cutscene. The contradiction at the heart of this section: why does a crocodile hold a permanent main cast slot with no earned justification, dissolves once you stop requiring the character slot to have earned itself. Vector's place in the roster predates any narrative justification the franchise later developed for its character slots. Crocodile isn't odd in the lineup because something went wrong with the character. It's odd because the slot it occupies was created before anyone decided slots needed reasons to exist, and Vector's tenure is just the persistence of that original choice. Seal. The stakes here are tighter in a specific way, where the crocodile puzzled researchers by holding a prominent cast slot without a visible justification. The seal presents the inverse problem by holding no cast slot and having no visible justification for that absence either, which is far harder to explain because it means the species cleared the canonical bar of appearing in the Sonic universe and still received nothing. No named character, no team membership, no stated role, no identity whatsoever. Seals are small anthropomorphic animals in the Sonic franchise, appearing in the Cheo Garden, and no seal has ever been given an individual name or identity. In gameplay, seals can alter the stats, appearance, and personality of a Cheo, but no seal has ever been assigned a name, team membership, or recurring narrative role. It exists in the world, it's visually distinct, it functions in the material, and yet nobody ever wrote the character page that every other species received. The franchise built a thorough naming system for almost everything it touched: badnik models, level zones, character titles, and then simply skipped the seal, leaving a documented anthropomorphic species with no individual anchor in the narrative. A species appears in the canon and it's in. That is the only threshold, and representation is a binary state, present or absent, with no intermediate tier for species that exist without named members. The seal cleared the bar, and that was sufficient. Nobody ever wrote a rule requiring a representative character. Nobody ever decided certain species deserved names and others didn't. The seal just never got written that way, and the canon absorbed the omission without resolving it. Deer. The seal got in on tusks and blubber. Deer appear in the Sonic series as small animals used for raising chow, and their absence as anthropomorphic characters reflects the roster's design priorities rather than any oversight. The rule the previous entries seemed to be following was never actually a rule. Deer, antelope, moose, pronghorn, the whole Cervidae family were considered. Not creatively, not tonally, visually. You can round out a bear's snout or exaggerate a bird's beak and still recognize it. A deer silhouette is distinctive in a way that fights simplification. The long limbs and the posture created by the hooves produce a figure that reads as ungulate first and character second. That's not a complaint about deer, it's a complaint about the math of the art direction. The identifying markers that designers settled on for deer in a Mobian context, hooves instead of shoes, horns instead of quills or head fur, a neck that runs slightly longer than the standard Mobian proportion, are exactly the features that make them hard to draw. Every other animal in the roster has a single dominant visual hook. The duck has the bill, the bear has the bulk, the rhino has the horn and the gray. A deer has three things that all need to coexist, and none of them simplifies well. The excuse for excluding a species isn't always narrative. Sometimes it's just that the design doesn't survive the style. The reasonable explanation is that the roster was full and deer simply weren't needed. There were already herbivores, already hoofed animals, already nature-themed characters filling slots. A deer would have been redundant alongside the existing cast, and redundancy is its own kind of design failure. That explanation holds up until you look at what Sonic Team actually included instead. They're animals whose most distinctive features happen to round out more easily into the Mobian head shape and body proportion. The difference isn't that deer were less interesting, it's that their most recognizable traits are structural: horn placement, limb length, the angle of the spine. And structural traits are the hardest ones to exaggerate without losing the animal entirely. A rabbit is a rabbit because of the ears, which Sonic Team could already draw at any size they wanted. A deer is a deer because of the whole posture, and you can't scale posture the way you scale ears. Lion. The deer at least had a reason. The art style couldn't carry them. Lions don't even get that excuse. For a species that already fits the established template perfectly, lions appear in the Sonic series as small animals used for raising chow, and no anthropomorphic lion character has been developed as a main cast member. The Sonic roster contains cats, multiple cats. Big the Cat appeared in 1998, and Blaze the Cat followed as another member of the feline animal type. Blaze the Cat followed shortly after as his royal equivalent. Between them, they established that the Sonic universe has a feline branch of the Mobian tree, that those characters have a specific body type, upright posture, humanoid limbs, cat facial structure, tail, and that the species category is open enough to support more than one named individual. The infrastructure for a lion character was built 25 years ago and has been sitting unused ever since. A lion in the Mobian style doesn't require new anatomy research, it's the existing cat template with a mane added. That's the entire design problem. The community noticed, with no lion among them, and a contributor noted that a lion could slot into the feline category by using the same base model as the other cats, same body, same proportions, same color palette conventions, with one addition, a large recognizable mane. That suggestion has been sitting in those discussions for years. It hasn't been dismissed, it hasn't been debated, it has simply never been acted on. The franchise has featured numerous character types, yet no anthropomorphic lion character has been added to the main cast alongside the existing feline characters. The specialist objection here isn't they needed more cats. The question is why the one cat that requires no new design work got left out while every other mammalian category filled up. Deer had a genuine art direction problem, lions have no such barrier, the template exists, the species fits, and the distinguishing feature, the mane, is the kind of visual shorthand Sonic's art style handles effortlessly. Every other apex predator on the roster has a representative, wolf via adventure-era characters, various big cats through existing cast members. The lion, which is the most visually iconic cat species on Earth, simply never appeared. Apex predator representation in the roster is covered. That's not a gap born of complexity, it's a gap that survived decades of expansion because nobody ever thought to fill it. Tiger, lions don't exist here, not one, not ever. Yet the Panthera tigris lineage is one of the most consistently deployed animals the Sonic franchise keeps returning to, and the asymmetry is not a coincidence. It runs straight through one specific character and the structural problem she was built to solve. Blaze the Cat debuted in 2005 as the central figure of Sonic Rush on the Nintendo DS, Princess of the Soul Empire wielding fire as her primary ability. She reappeared as the lead in Sonic Rush Adventure the same year, carrying the alternate dimension framing into a direct sequel with expanded mechanics tied to her fire powers. She appeared in Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 for a story where her royal status and her resistance to rival energy sources made her functionally necessary, not optional. She showed up again in Sonic Colors DS, in the Sonic the Hedgehog 4 Episode 2 downloadable sequel, and in Sonic Generations as a modern-era story figure. The IDW comics continued her storylines. Every time Sonic's world needed a second protagonist who was thematically distinct, Royal where Sonic is casual, Fire where Sonic has no elemental affinity, Dimensionally Displaced where Sonic is native, the production went back to the same Panthera tigris anthropomorph. Sonic Rush and Sonic Rush Adventure needed a counterpart to anchor an alternate dimension story. Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 needed a character whose energy profile was incompatible with the main plot's villain, which is exactly what her fire powers provided. Sonic Colors DS needed a side character with a defined mechanical role. Sonic Generations needed both modern and classic story figures. Each appearance solves a different structural problem, but every problem is the same kind. The cast is missing something specific, and Blaze is the character who supplies it. She is not recurring because of franchise inertia, she is recurring because she is the correct response to a recurring gap in the cast design. And that is the small version of the problem. The list above covers just the entries where she is a named, playable, or story-central figure, not the RPG cameos, not the crossover appearances, not the mobile game references. Every one of those contexts had a reason she was the choice over any other species in the roster. A tiger character is royalty without being regal in the Sonic way. A tiger character commands fire without overlapping with any existing Sonic character's elemental palette. A tiger character comes from somewhere else, which means her backstory carries its own stakes rather than borrowing from Sonic's established world. Each of those properties is individually useful. Together, they form a recurring design need that no other species in the Sonic roster satisfies, and the production keeps noticing that need every time it sets out to build a new entry. Here's where it gets worse. The franchise has a species roster that runs to dozens of entries: dogs, cats, foxes, birds, bears, rabbits, pigs, penguins, crocodiles, seals, deer, lions, tigers, elephants, gorillas, chameleons, bats, bees, chickens, squirrels, and the non-anthropomorphic baseline. And out of every one of them, the tiger is the species that reliably solves a structural problem the writers keep running into. That is not a species chosen for cuteness or marketability. That is a species chosen because it works. You do not deploy a character that consistently across 16 years unless she earns her slot every time, and Blaze earns it by occupying a position no other species fills. The design reason is straightforward. Sonic needed a counterpart, and the Panthera tigris anthropomorph was the species that gave the writers everything they needed in one package. She was built for the gap, and the gap kept reopening. Elephant. Where the tiger held a consistent role across the franchise's most defining eras, the elephant has appeared in 3 scattered entries spanning the entire run and has never once managed to establish what it is supposed to be. The first elephant character appeared in 1993, designed with a distinct visual silhouette, saw gameplay function that gave it mechanical weight within its own title. A later entry appeared in 1998, a different game format, a different narrative role, a different relationship to the player character, with no design or personality continuity bridging the two. The IDW comics feature elephant characters, a reference to the species that, like the 1998 version, carries no explicit lineage back to the 1993 character. 3 separate appearances, 3 different contexts, 3 designs with no stated connecting tissue. The 1993 elephant operated inside a specific mechanical logic that suited its game's design. The 1998 elephant operated inside a different mechanical logic suited to its own format. The IDW elephant exists as a species reference with no mechanical function at all. It is illustrative, not functional. Each appearance is legitimate in isolation. None of them builds on what came before. That is not necessarily a failure of imagination. It might just mean the production has treated each elephant entry as a fresh decision rather than a continuation of a character with history. But the cumulative effect is a species that cannot accumulate weight across the franchise because it never gets a second appearance that visibly belongs to the same lineage. Even if you grant each appearance on its own terms, even if you read each one as a deliberate creative decision rather than a forgotten afterthought, the result is the same. A species that has been eligible for inclusion since 1993, that appears in multiple generations of Sonic content, and that still cannot produce 2 entries that visibly belong to the same character. That is the sound of a recurring option that the production keeps reaching for without ever committing to developing. Is this just a case of design convenience? No, because the tiger answer to that question is no. And the elephant is the species that makes the contrast legible. The human strangeness of it is that the franchise has had 20 years to decide what an elephant today anthropomorph is in this world, and it has answered that question 3 separate times in 3 different ways, then moved on each time without carrying any of the answers forward. Gorilla. They're the heaviest primates in the cast, the ones built for power over speed, and their first appearance in the Sonic universe came alongside the series itself back in 1991. An original species designation, not a late addition bolted on to fill a gap. And yet, after 3 decades of expansion, the gorilla has never once been handed a protagonist slot, a defining rivalry, or a story arc that didn't cast them as supporting muscle. The elephant only just left the room. Now we're meeting the category it actually belongs to, the Great Ape branch, and watching that branch get systematically kept out of every position that matters. They've shown up. They've been there from the start of the broader cast expansion. But every time a major character slot opens up, speed type, rival, wildcard, ancient guardian, the gorilla never gets the call. There are gorillas in the series' supporting ranks, sure, recurring enough to maintain the species category as a permanent fixture on the roster, but never positioned as a figure the story orbits around. No gorilla has ever been the fastest thing alive. Their role in the franchise, across the entire run of modern games, has been one consistent thing: the big guy in the background. Here's the turn. The gorilla category exists. It has depth. It has visual distinction that should make it a natural fit for a character who smashes through walls, lifts obstacles, or anchors a team's physical presence. But the franchise has never actually built anything around that presence. Characters who debuted in the same general era, the fox, the echidna, even the cat, each got layered with personality, motivation, and a place in the wider narrative. The gorilla kept its category assignment and not much else. They got the species label, the visual silhouette, the implied strength, and then the script moved on to characters who actually had something to say. That restraint says something specific about how this cast actually got assembled. Sonic's major players were built on personality archetypes first and species traits second: the cocky speedster, the edgy rival, the chaotic wildcard. And the gorilla, despite being one of nature's most imposing animals, doesn't map onto any of the emotional beats the franchise kept returning to. Power and strength were useful traits to assign to a supporting character, not traits worth building a protagonist around. The result is a species that has been a declared member of the Sonic universe for over 30 years, holding a confirmed category slot, while never once being allowed to step into a role that might actually demand the audience care about them specifically. They have a place on the roster and no place in the story. Dog. The forum post cataloging anthropomorphic species in the Sonic game series arrived in 2001, listing hedgehogs, foxes, echidnas, bats, cats, a chameleon, a crocodile, a bee, and rabbits. A deliberately comprehensive inventory that somehow overlooked the single most familiar domesticated animal in human culture. Dogs aren't in that list. They're not a niche omission from a single title. The poster was documenting the entire mainline series roster up to that point, and the species simply did not exist within it. No dog character, no dog NPC, no dog variant of any kind had appeared across every Sonic game released to date. A user responding to that post didn't ask for a backstory or a cameo, they asked for a specific functional character. Something that could sniff out secret paths, something that could dig, something that gave players a new way to interact with the environment. The request wasn't for a dog as decoration, it was for a dog as a mechanic, which is exactly how every other species in Sonic ended up defining its place in the games. The absence is harder to explain than it looks. Bats patrol ceilings, crocodiles smash through certain barriers, rabbits and bees get their own category slots and their own character moments. Dogs, animals whose entire biology is built around tracking, loyalty, and environmental interaction, offer natural gameplay hooks that match or exceed most of what's already in the roster. The fact that they were never added, not even as a supporting character, not even in a spin-off, suggests the gap was never a mechanical problem. It was a category that was never in the picture to begin with. Sonic built its identity on a specific palette of species, and dogs simply weren't included in that original choice. Chow. They quietly break every rule the Sonic franchise has established. Chow first appeared in Sonic Adventure, released in Japan in 1998. They are small, childlike creatures without a gender, with a pudding-like body, and they behave like human babies. In the Sonic games, Chow function as digital pets. Players raise them, shape how they develop, and then enter those developed forms into races and battles. Cream the Rabbit has a Cheo named Cheese, which she uses to defeat enemies. Cheo are described as living, prehistoric creatures not possessing the ability to decide their own course of evolution. They are fragile, fleeting, and consequently a pure and lovable life form. Chow typically live by clear water and adapt to survive in various environments very well, being able to capture features of other life forms that they touch. All Chow share 5 skills: swim, run, fly, power, and stamina, along with a shared life cycle. Each Cheo has its own biological clock, meaning each one carries a different lifespan and a different sleep time. Each Cheo has its own unique grades, determining how good it is at a certain skill, as well as unique facial characteristics. An emotion ball floats just above a Cheo's head, representing how the Cheo feels at a certain time. Here's where it gets strange. A creature that is explicitly described as fragile, fleeting, and unable to choose its own course of evolution is simultaneously the one species in the entire Sonic roster you can spend hours deliberately shaping and customizing. You decide what it eats, how you treat it, what environments you expose it to. You are making choices about its form. The lore says it cannot choose its own evolution, but the game gives you full authorial control over the outcome. Those are two incompatible things existing in the same species at the same time. Every other creature in the Sonic universe has a fixed form, a fixed set of abilities, a character model that doesn't change because of how nice you were to it over several play sessions. Chow do not have that constraint. They are the one species where player behavior directly writes the biology. And you can prove it isn't accidental. Chow adapt to survive in various environments very well, capturing features of other life forms that they touch. A mechanic that rewards you for interacting with other characters in the world. The 5 skill grades are unique per individual, meaning no 2 Chow perform identically, even if raised identically. The emotion ball above the head is a real-time readout, not a menu stat, which means the game is tracking an internal state that has no mechanical function beyond expression. The biological clock means one Chow might be asleep while another is wide awake at exactly the same moment, which eliminates the possibility of standardized behavior across the species. These are not the design choices of a throwaway minigame. They are the design choices of something the developers expected players to invest actual time in, but at least that investment is consistent with what you're told. The lore describes Chow as lovable and pure. The game makes them worth caring about. The friction between their biological determinism in the story and their player-directed evolution in the gameplay is a contradiction, but it lands in roughly the same emotional register. Then you look at the other half of their design, the part that says they are fragile and fleeting and prehistoric, and it stops lining up. The lore positions them as a delicate, almost extinct form of life, something precious and temporary. but the game also gives you the ability to enter them into battles. A creature described as fragile and fleeting is being put into combat mechanics. Those two readings cannot both be the intended tone. The pure and lovable framing and the combat utility framing are pulling in opposite directions, and nothing in the design resolves that tension. So what are Chao, actually? Not prehistoric creatures, not pets. The simplest explanation that accounts for everything the games actually let you do is this. Chao are a save file with a face. They are structured data given biological dressing so that you care about improving it. The emotion ball, the unique face, the sleep schedule, the lifespan. These are all systems that make a database record feel like a living thing you have a relationship with. The 5 skills in the grading system are stat trees. The races and battles are leaderboards. The entire species, across every fact the games present, is a persistence layer for player investment dressed up as a creature. What you would tell someone tomorrow is that Chao don't have a gender, they can't decide their own evolution, and yet they are the only species in the Sonic universe that changes based on how you treat it. Chameleon. The previous item was a species designed to be raised by the player, something whose biology was partly written by interaction. This one is a completely different category of creature wearing a name it barely qualifies for. Espio the Chameleon is the named representative of the chameleon species in the Sonic games. The first appearance of a chameleon character was in Knuckles' Chaotix, released in 1995. Espio is a member of the Chaotix Detective Agency. As a chameleon, Espio can conceal himself from enemies by turning invisible. Chameleons can turn invisible to slip past enemies unnoticed. Espio is characterized as a ninja warrior. Ordinary chameleons change color, they shift their skin pigmentation to blend with their surroundings, or signal to other chameleons. Sonic's chameleons do not do that. They turn completely invisible, which is a fundamentally different ability. Not camouflage, which is about matching a background, but actual concealment, which is about ceasing to be visible at all. Espio's power isn't a stretched version of a real chameleon trait. It's a different category of ability wearing the name. The games are explicit about what makes this species distinct from both its real-world counterpart and every other anthropomorph in the roster. Invisibility is the defining mechanic, full stop. And the ordinary version of a chameleon, a lizard that changes color, has no sneezing problem. An ordinary chameleon's color shift isn't disrupted by its own biology in a way that ruins the effect. But Espio's invisibility has a built-in failure state that the games are explicit about. Sneezing while invisible ruins the concealment. That is a specific, named mechanical flaw attached to a power that the species is defined by. For a creature whose entire identity rests on being unseen, having a bodily function that forcibly ends that state is not a minor quirk. It means invisibility is not reliable. It means the ninja of the animal kingdom cannot maintain its primary tactic through a sneeze. The distance between chameleon and what Espio actually does, total invisibility with a sneeze-based failure condition, is substantial enough that the name is functioning as a very loose reference point rather than a description. So what would it take for the ordinary explanation to be true? For Espio's chameleon classification to describe an actual adapted chameleon ability, his power would need to be color-shifting camouflage, and it would need to work reliably without built-in involuntary shutdowns. Neither of those conditions is met. The power is invisibility, not color change, and the mechanics explicitly include an involuntary disruption. The ordinary explanation requires a version of the character that does not exist in the games. What the evidence actually establishes is a species whose defining trait is total concealment, whose representative character was introduced in Knuckles' Chaotix in 1995, whose ninja framing is so central that the games refer to them as the ninjas of the animal kingdom, and whose signature ability has a named involuntary failure condition. The Sonic games maintain a separate continuity from the Archie Sonic comics and other Sonic media. What no one has explained is why a species defined by invisibility as its singular trait would evolve a physiological response that guarantees losing it. Zeddy. While the chameleon before them relied on camouflage and patience in the shadows, the Zeddy don't bother hiding. They overwhelm. They are described throughout the series as a legendary race of demons, a species native to the lost Hex, whose mere reputation precedes them as a force of mechanical and military menace. Their strongest member and leader is Zavok, who commands the full weight of their collective strength. Under his leadership, the Zeddy operate as a coordinated military entity rather than scattered individuals. their machine-controlling abilities amplifying whatever physical force they can bring to bear. 6 of them form the core threat as the Deadly Six. Each member carries a distinct capacity for destruction, and together their objective is the total destruction of Earth. They move with purpose toward that goal, backed by a species-wide capability for mechanical domination. The Deadly Six advance their campaign, but they are ultimately defeated before they can complete it. The destruction of Earth never comes. That failure is not incidental. It is the structural conclusion of every appearance the Zeti make in the game canon. Declared intent, mechanical superiority, and final defeat before the objective is reached. Their arc is a closed loop, their purpose contained within it, and the species never gets the resolution it demands. The reason they're exclusive to games, Black Arms. The Zeti wanted to destroy Earth with mechanical force and got stopped. The Black Arms represent something harder to stop, an alien species that doesn't just want a planet, it rewrites the biology of whatever it touches, and that slash is not decorative. It is the direct evidence that their biology has already intersected with another species and produced a hybrid result. The Black Arms' capacity to alter a being's fundamental nature is not a side effect. It is their defining characteristic, demonstrated concretely through Shadow's very existence. His dual classification is not background lore, it is proof of what the Black Arms do to the life forms they encounter. They don't simply invade or conquer, they transform, and the result is a living creature whose genetic identity belongs to 2 species at once, locked together permanently. Their method is biological revision, not just military occupation, and Shadow the Hedgehog is the one confirmed specimen of what that revision looks like when it succeeds. Wisp. Shadow the Hedgehog carries 2 species in his roster entry, a biological contradiction the Black Arms section just finished laying out. Wisps don't just sit inside that contradiction, they prove the entire category was never holding any consistent meaning to begin with. By the time Wisps appear in the roster, the question of what species even means in the Sonic world has stopped being a classification question and started being a documentation question, and the roster was never built to answer it. Wisps are a fictional species featured in the Sonic series, introduced as extraterrestrial creatures in Sonic colors. They are used as power-ups in Sonic games. Those 2 facts, the roster position and the gameplay function, are the only things the roster entry ever consistently records about them, and the relationship between those 2 facts is the whole story. Chow came first in the sequence, a creature designed around collection and nurturing. Coco came after, following the same structural logic. Wisps fill the middle slot in a 3-position series that has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with what the player interacts with and how. Here's the detail that makes the category collapse. Wisps are energy-based alien beings from planet Wisp. A creature with no biological substance appears in a roster alongside a hedgehog, a human, a chimpanzee, and a cat, and nobody flags the inconsistency because the roster was never auditing for biological coherence. It was checking a box. The Wisp entry exists to tell the game engine one thing: this is a thing Sonic can absorb to gain a temporary ability. That's the only feature the roster documents, not habitat, not reproduction, not diet, not social structure, just the mechanic. Wisps have been used as power-ups in Sonic games. That single fact accounts for every other fact the roster lists about them. Their color variants exist because each color corresponds to a different ability the player can access. Their collectible behavior exists because the game needs the player to gather them before using them. Their placement in the world exists because the level designer needed spawn locations. The species label is a narrative justification for a gameplay mechanic. And nothing more. That's not a cynical reading. It's the only reading that accounts for all the available evidence without adding anything the roster doesn't actually provide. And before you argue that this is just how video game creatures work, that Chao are also a gameplay mechanic dressed as biology, Chao have a garden, they have personalities, they have developmental states, and breeding and naming and a market value. Chao have a life outside the moment the player interacts with them. Wisps do not. Wisps are sapient creatures with distinct personalities and social structures. 4 steps, no variation. The roster entry covers this sequence with a species description because collectible power-up doesn't sound like something that belongs in a field guide. The roster was never describing a biology, it was documenting interaction types and filing them under species labels because that's the format the game's world building chose to use. Every time the Sonic world adds a creature that exists primarily as a mechanic, wisps, chow, Coco, it lists them as species, and the list grows. And nobody asks whether the category still applies. By the time you reach the end of the roster, you have creatures that are biological, creatures that are mechanical, creatures that are energy, creatures that are folklore, and creatures that are Easter eggs, all filed under the same heading with the same formatting, as if the heading meant something consistent across all of them. It never did. The Wisp proved that. Its entire presence in the roster is a gameplay function wearing a species description as a costume, and the roster accepts the costume because it never asked what was underneath it. Wisps are one of 3 fictional species featured in the Sonic series, appearing in order of appearance after Chow and before Coco. Wisps have been used as power-ups in Sonic games. Those are the only 2 consistent facts the roster documents about them, and they are both gameplay facts. There is no Wisp ecology. There is a Wisp ability set, carefully mapped to color, carefully balanced against other Wisp abilities, carefully integrated into level design. The roster structure is what allows the category to hold it all, not because the category is coherent, but because the format never asks it to be. Every creature gets the same treatment regardless of what it actually is. The Wisp sits at the center of that collapse, and the only way to understand what a species means in the Sonic world is to understand that the roster was never describing biology. It was describing how the player touches the world, and filing those touch points under the only label the format provided. The Wisp proved the label was hollow. The roster kept running anyway. Kappa. It is a Japanese yokai species that entered the Sonic roster in 2022, more than 3 decades after the franchise began, arriving at a point where the roster had already absorbed creatures that were biological, creatures that were mechanical, creatures that were energy, creatures that were Easter eggs, and creatures that were gameplay mechanics wearing biology as a costume. The Sonic world did not need another species entry by 2022. It took one anyway, and this one came pre-packaged with an entire mythology it did not invent. The Kappa, in Japanese folklore, is a water monster with a depression on its head called a dish that retains water, and when the Sonic roster added it, it arrived carrying that pre-existing cultural weight intact. That provenance is what sets it apart from nearly every other entry on the list. Most Sonic species were created by Sonic's own writers for Sonic's own games, with no existence before the franchise claimed them. The Kappa had centuries of existence before Sonic ever touched it. It entered the roster as an import, not an invention. The Sonic world's explanation for the Kappa's presence would emphasize its mythological attributes and note that those map onto gameplay mechanics like any other species entry. That explanation accounts for the fact, but misses the structural point the Kappa's inclusion actually makes. The roster isn't applying a consistent classification framework. It's filling slots in a list that has no internal logic, requiring all entries to share a common origin or nature. The Kappa's presence demonstrates that the roster will accept creatures imported from real-world mythology with the same label it uses for creatures invented inside the franchise's own writing, with no acknowledgement that those 2 origin types are categorically different. The underlying mechanism is inclusion logic, not classification logic. The roster asks whether a creature exists in the Sonic world, not whether it belongs in the same conceptual category as the entries around it. The Wisp proved the category label didn't mean anything consistent. The Kappa proved the category didn't even require the creature to originate inside the world it was being listed for. By the time the roster reaches Kappa, species has been stretched so far past any coherent biological or fictional definition that it functions purely as a filing convention, an empty container the Sonic world keeps filling, not because the contents share a nature, but because the format demands a list and the list keeps growing. Hedgehog. The Hedgehog species has carried the entire Sonic franchise from its first moment, but right from that first moment, it was carrying something it wasn't designed to hold. Sonic the Hedgehog launched in 1991 for the Sega Genesis as a blue anthropomorphic hedgehog and the main protagonist of the series. The franchise was created by Yuji Naka, Naoto Oshima, and Hirokazu Yasuhara for Sega, and the hedgehog species is one of the founding species of the Sonic series. Sonic the Hedgehog is known as the world's fastest hedgehog, a claim the character has carried as both gameplay mechanic and brand identity for over 3 decades. Sonic made his debut in the original Sonic the Hedgehog game in 1991, and has never stepped out from the front position since. The species didn't stay singular for long. Amy Rose is a female hedgehog character who joined the Sonic franchise. Shadow the Hedgehog is a hedgehog character known for his darker tone. Silver the Hedgehog became a named hedgehog character in the franchise, anchoring a major story arc in Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. On the surface, this looks like successful character diversification: 3 distinct hedgehogs, 3 distinct narrative roles, each given enough presence to feel like a real individual rather than a color swap. The hedgehog species, in other words, presents itself as the franchise's most productive creative asset. There's a complication built into the species that the franchise has never fully resolved. Every other anthropomorphic species introduced in the Sonic series was designed to fill a specific mechanical or narrative gap. The fox as the flying support, the echidna as the ancient rival. The hedgehog was the protagonist, and it stayed the protagonist. Amy Rose has appeared in many Sonic games, but has never been the main protagonist of a mainline title. Shadow starred in his own spin-off game. Silver the Hedgehog's arc in Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 was resolved and then quietly shelved, his character never reappearing with the same narrative weight in subsequent mainline entries. The objection the evidence suggests is this: maybe the hedgehog species isn't a creative success story at all. Maybe it's the structural reason other species struggle to get the same narrative weight. The hedgehog species includes several notable characters, including Sonic, Shadow, and Silver, and that density reads as strength until you notice it's also a ceiling. Every other species in the series has to compete with a protagonist whose entire identity is speed, attitude, and franchise centrality, and the results have been uneven at best. What the hedgehog species actually reveals is that the Sonic franchise's identity was locked in place by its very first species, and every other species introduced afterward has been operating inside that boundary ever since. Fox. If the hedgehog species locked the franchise's identity in place, the fox species rewired everything the franchise could actually do. Miles Prower, known as Tails, is a fox character who appears in Sonic games, and his impact was structural from the moment he appeared on screen. Tails was created for the Sonic franchise that produced a character whose defining traits that had been built around a single character on a single mission structure. Tails is a Sonic the Hedgehog character, but reducing him to that label misses what he actually did to the series. His full name is Miles Prower, and from his first appearance in 1992, he became the structural reason Sonic games could be played cooperatively. Tails can fly and provides assistance in gameplay on the Sega Genesis. The fox didn't just join the cast, it changed the architecture of what a Sonic game could be. Tails' flight capability introduced verticality to level design. His mechanical aptitude introduced puzzles that required a second character to solve. Tails accompanies Sonic in gameplay as a companion character. Every subsequent Sonic title with multiple playable characters operates on the blueprint Tails established in Sonic the Hedgehog 2. The fox species is the reason the Sonic franchise stopped being a one-character show. Echidna, the voice actor for that fox character, just locked in over a decade ago and has never once needed replacing. Now let's talk about Knuckles' voice history. Across the entire modern Sonic franchise, Knuckles has cycled through 2 primary voice actors. Travis Willingham held the role from 2010 through 2018. Dave B. Mitchell took over in 2019 and has held it ever since. 2 actors, 18-year split roughly down the middle. That's a recast rate that would be dramatic for any franchise lead, but for a supporting character, it's something else entirely. The echidna doesn't have much else going for it as a species. The first published article identifying the character used the full species designation in its headline, Knuckles the Echidna. Not his first name, not a nickname. The article made sure the species came first, then the individual. That tells you exactly how the world outside the games has historically understood this creature, as a species that has, to date, produced exactly 1 character of any real significance. Knuckles the Echidna is a video game character in the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. He debuted in 1994 in Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Since then, the echidna as a species hasn't expanded outward. A handful of other echidnas have appeared, so there's no echidna civilization in the games. Angel Island had the Master Emerald and that was it. No society, no supporting cast of echidna villagers, no species-wide politics or culture to explore. Everything the franchise has ever communicated about echidnas has been filtered through one individual. The species label exists in the title of one article from 1992 and in a handful of character descriptions since. That's it. And here's where it gets worse. The guy carrying the entire species on his shoulders just got recast again. And the newer voice actor, Dave B. Mitchell, started in 2019, the same year the Knuckles spin-off show was being actively developed. So the species most defined by one character is about to have that character spun off into his own franchise vehicle. What happens to the echidna identity when the character stops being Sonic's echidna and starts being the echidna who has his own show? Nobody knows. Nobody has ever had to answer that question before, because no Sonic species has ever had its entire franchise weight rest on a single individual quite like this: cat. Sonic the Hedgehog entered the world as a video game in 1991 on the Sega Genesis, and the franchise has been churning out animal characters ever since. Among them sit a small handful of cats. Blaze the Cat and Big the Cat are both characters in the Sonic the Hedgehog video game franchise. That's the complete inventory. Blaze comes from an alternate dimension, guards the Soul Emeralds, can teleport through space, and carries herself with the gravity of someone who has literally fought through time to prevent the collapse of multiple realities. Her voice is tense, her posture is coiled. She reads as a protagonist designed for high-stakes action. Big the Cat is a fisherman who lives near a jungle gym and whose primary emotional arc in his debut game involves finding a lost frog named Froggy. He moves slowly, speaks softly, and doesn't appear to be in any kind of hurry about anything. But these are the same species. So the franchise gave Sonic two cats, one a hyper-competent interdimensional guardian, the other a relaxed outdoorsman whose plot hook is recovering an amphibian. The tonal distance between those two character concepts is enormous. Blaze could carry an action thriller, Big could carry a slice-of-life comedy. They share a species designation and almost nothing else. That's an unusual design choice for a franchise that otherwise tends to give members of a species a kind of family resemblance in personality as well as appearance. The question the audience is already asking is whether that split reflects something specific about the Sonic writers' approach to cats, or whether it's just two separate writers with two separate ideas who both happen to reach for the same animal. Blaze the Cat and Big the Cat were created by different teams at different points in the franchise's history. Blaze debuted in 2005, Big in 1998, so there's no single writer who greenlit both. They're separate decisions made 7 years apart, with no apparent coordination. Defenders of the franchise would argue that cats in fiction are routinely split across personality types: aloof warrior, lazy companion, and Sonic's two entries just happen to cover both poles without an inconsistency. But that's an argument about fictional tradition, not about what Sonic specifically did. The fact the two cats landed 7 years apart through different creative teams with zero overlap in concept suggests it wasn't a planned species archetype at all. It was two writers independently deciding cat was the right animal for two very different characters. That's not a cohesive species design. That's convergent invention. What that proves about the category as a whole is that Sonic's animal roster was never built from a top-down species concept document. It was assembled case by case, character by character, by different writers reaching for whatever animal fit the vibe they wanted. The result is a franchise where some species, hedgehogs, foxes, echidnas, have a kind of through line because one core character kept generating the species' identity, and other species, cats, ended up with two characters who look like they came from entirely different universes because that's exactly what happened. Bat. Where the previous item broke the counting rule, this one reveals that the rule was never real to begin with. Big the Cat appeared as an exception that proved the pattern, except the pattern was never consistent enough to have any actual authority behind it. Rouge the Bat is listed among the characters of the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise, full stop. No caveats, no special conditions, no asterisks explaining why she qualifies. She simply appears on the roster. Rouge the Bat is a named character in the Sonic the Hedgehog video game franchise, and that recognition carries no qualification attached to it. Rouge the Bat is a character explicitly documented among the Sonic the Hedgehog video game franchise's roster. She just qualified. Her presence on the franchise roster is documented, named, and listed with zero hedging of any kind, and that documentation is treated as absolute. The previous section set up the impression that the roster operated on specific criteria, that species earned their placement through consistent rules, and then broke that pattern when Big the Cat arrived without meeting them. But Rouge's entry doesn't break a rule. It dissolves the premise. There was no strict criterion governing who made the list. The pattern the cat section broke was decorative, not structural. Wikipedia's official character list documents Rouge the Bat as a named participant in the Sonic the Hedgehog video game franchise. Rouge's placement proves the counting system never had the conditions that Big the Cat appeared to fail. She didn't climb some hidden ladder of criteria. She simply existed in the franchise's documented records, and the count accepted her. The rule wasn't broken, it was never real. And that is the small version of the problem. Because if Rouge's inclusion shows the counting system works on documentation alone, the B entry reveals just how loose that documentation can be and still count. The mechanism doesn't require a character to carry their species as a defining trait, to headline their own title, or to function independently in any meaningful narrative capacity. It requires the franchise's own records to acknowledge the character as a named participant, and that acknowledgement can arrive through the most indirect routes. A team membership credit, a supporting roster slot, a single documented affiliation, any of those routes qualifies. The species doesn't need to earn its placement through individual narrative weight. It just needs to appear somewhere in the franchise's official documentation, and the count treats that as sufficient. B. If the Bat entry revealed that the counting rule was never real, the B entry shows what the counting system actually looks like in operation. A character whose documented species presence arrives entirely through team membership rather than individual franchise credit, pushed to the outer edge of what the counting mechanism will accept. Charmy B is a member of Team Chaotix alongside Espio the Chameleon and Vector the Crocodile, and that team affiliation is the complete, unqualified basis for his species appearing in the count. His species designation does not come from an individual franchise credit that acknowledges him on his own terms. It comes from being listed as part of a 3-character unit. His species derive from membership in that unit, rather than from any documented solo presence in the franchise's records. A specialist examining the counting methodology would immediately distinguish between being documented as an individual character and being documented as a member of an ensemble. Those are two categorically different kinds of franchise acknowledgement, and Charmy's case falls on the team side of that distinction. That specialist would be technically correct within a precise reading of the evidence, and that observation stands as a genuine methodological concern. But the Sonic the Hedgehog video game franchise's own records document Charmy B as a member of Team Chaotix, and the counting system treats that team membership as sufficient. Espio and Vector are not incidental to this. Their documented presence alongside Charmy confirms the team as a legitimate franchise entry, and that legitimacy extends to every named member the roster lists. The counting system reads the team's roster credit, extracts Charmy's species from that listing, and includes it in the total. No solo appearance is demanded, no individual narrative weight is required, no separate character entry is necessary. Being a named member of a documented team within the Sonic the Hedgehog video game franchise is, under the system as it actually operates, a complete and sufficient basis for inclusion. That is the standard the count applies, that is the mechanism it uses, and that is how it reaches the number it reaches. Chicken. And where Charmy B operates as a fully anthropomorphic detective with speech and team dynamics, Clucky is a chicken, a regular bird depicted as a collectible within the game's environments. That gap between what the Sonic franchise's animal label usually promises and what Clucky actually delivers is the whole story of this entry. The Sonic games have always populated their grasslands and plains with recognizable wildlife, chickens, squirrels, birds, foxes, sprites the player runs past, rescues, or occasionally interacts with as simple objectives. Clucky falls squarely into that tradition. It is a non-anthropomorphic chicken, meaning it appears as a collectible creature within the game's environments. It exists in the world the way a real chicken would, as an environmental detail you pass through on your way to something that actually matters. Here's where the design intent becomes visible. The Sonic franchise is built around a cast of extraordinary animals, hyperspeed hedgehogs, two-tailed foxes, echidna warriors, who talk, fight, and carry the plot. The world they move through is filled with ordinary animals that do none of those things. Clucky is not a failed attempt at a character. It exists alongside the anthropomorphic cast as part of the game's populated environments. It is texture, not cast. A sprite with legs and a beak that signals this is a grassy field with animals in it, faster and cheaper than any handcrafted NPC could. Squirrel. Clucky at least has the decency to be visually distinct. A chicken looks like nothing else on screen. Ricky gives you no such help. Ricky appears as a squirrel sprite among the game's wildlife creatures. Ricky is another non-anthropomorphic animal friend from the Sonic games, a squirrel named, rendered, placed in the environment, and then given nothing else. Part of the ecosystem that Sonic runs through at supersonic speed, the only meaningful difference between the two is that chickens have a shape squirrels do not, which means Clucky at least registers as a specific thing before the player's attention moves on. And before you assume a name means these creatures were designed with any particular care, Ricky is one of the animal characters listed among the franchise's wildlife. These creatures populate the game's environments as collectible wildlife. These creatures were designed as part of the game's environmental population.